Thank you so much for coming to our panel tonight this morning on medical ethics. I am so pleased to have such a wonderful panel of speakers today. I'll introduce them in the order that they'll speak. On my left, I have Stephanie Davies-Arai, who is the director of Transgender Trend and the author of Communicating with Kids. Next to her is Sue Evans, psychoanalyst, psychotherapist, co-author of Gender Dysphoria, a therapeutic model for working with children, adolescents, and young adults. Catchy. And also a key player in the Tavistock scandal. On my right is Jennifer Lahl, who is the founder of the Center for Bioethics and Culture and the program director for GenSpect USA. And on her right, I have Dr. Margaret McCartney, a GP, writer, broadcaster, academic, and at the University of St. Andrews. And then last, but certainly not least, on my far left, I have, is this left? Yes. I have Stella O'Malley, psychotherapist, director of GenSpect, author of What Your Teen is Trying to Tell You, and many other books too. So we're going to have a lot of discussion today. I'll introduce the speakers to speak each for 5 minutes, and then we're going to come straight out to you. There's a lot to talk about. I know that a lot of people here will want to talk about gender, but gender is not the only fruit. There's the opioid crisis, and when you start digging into this, there are scandals around HRT, around Tylenol, antibiotics. So there's a lot to talk about. So with that, I would like to introduce Stephanie.
So I'll go straight in. The WPATH standards of care were never like any other clinical guideline. The Endocrine Society recommended the use and does recommend the use of puberty blockers on the basis of low quality or very low quality evidence according to their own grading system. And they've had that since, I think, 2011. We've always known. CAS, after 4 years of an independent review, has found exactly the same, as we should have known. If it wasn't clear before, back in 2017, it became obvious that WPATH are first and foremost an activist lobby. And that year, the USPATH conference in Los Angeles cancelled the second scheduled talk by Kenneth Zucker, and he was the most experienced clinician and researcher in the area. After his first talk was disrupted by activists, he then demanded a meeting, and WPATH and USPATH bowed to the activists. His second talk was cancelled, and the board posted apologies. And if you saw the videos of that conference's evening gala, it's typical of scenes that we see. Trans activists were celebrating their win, demanding that WPATH change, and that the standards of care change to affirm transgender identities as completely normal. And so the videos really show that this is no normal patient advocacy group. These are activists. There are parallels, I think, with the opioid scandal. In that case, a pharmaceutical company employed salespeople to conduct a hard sell of a painkiller they claimed was not addictive. And that's very reminiscent, I think, of the trans activist groups online and going into schools and directly targeting children to sell gender identity, the concept of gender identity to school children. In the case of opioids, they made up a new condition they called breakthrough pain, and they claimed there was a research study proving the drug was safe and effective. They told doctors that prescribing the drug was the only responsible way to alleviate their patient's pain. It was kindness to administer it and cruelty to withhold it. Where have we heard that before? And of course, there wasn't actually a research study that proved it was safe. And one of the parallels is that they claimed only 1% of people became addicted, which is like the 1% they say that the regret rate is. So you can see the parallels, but I think there is a difference that transgender is not a medical diagnosis at all. The word refers to a political cultural group, and it was founded on a belief in a kind of gendered soul. And it was created through social control, including the mass indoctrination of children and the silencing and punishment of any dissent. And this, I think, we haven't seen before. So affirming a girl as a boy or a boy as a girl was almost unheard of a decade ago. And persistence rates under the approach of watchful waiting, where children weren't affirmed and socially transitioned, were much, much lower. So there's no historic precedent for this, and the explosion in the number of adolescents, predominantly girls, suddenly declaring an opposite-sex identity. And I just want to take up one point from Cass, because she talks about the fact that social contagion is the most controversial idea, and she doesn't really go into it much. But she actually does include quite a lot about the social and cultural environment that this generation is growing up in, and how it's different to previous generations, and the ways in which it's potentially more difficult. And she mentions another social contagion that happened during lockdown, and that was the contagion of ticks. So I've always felt it makes no sense. If we take just this group of the so-called rapid onset girls, it makes no sense to relate this group to historic cases of gender dysphoria. And it certainly makes no sense to link them with older heterosexual cross-dressing men. And the trans umbrella is not a helpful framework to use for this group. So we know that socially transmitted conditions or disorders typically disproportionately affect adolescent girls. And the sudden development of Tourette's-like symptoms among teenage girls during lockdown was linked to social media exposure. It was even referred to as TikTok tics. And it was understood that this was a social contagion. And can you imagine that anybody daring to refer to TikTok trans? In other areas, health, we're allowed to speak freely. We're allowed to explore the issues and see and place conditions where they belong. I think certainly the case of rapid onset girls and some boys as well belongs in the area of social contagion. What we know about that does not belong in the area of trans.
So I come from a clinical perspective on this, and one of the most important things in this area, in my opinion, is assessment, good assessment. It's ordinary good mental health work. And many of the people who experience gender dysphoria or trans identities do have a background of comorbidities, of mental health issues, of abuse. Some are struggling with their sexual identity or orientation. And certainly the kids need careful care. And so I'm never quite sure why there's so much controversy about the idea that we want to talk with them first. So one of the most important things about certain diagnoses is that you make them not by speaking to the patient necessarily, but by speaking to those who are in close contact with them. For example, you could find someone describe their ex-partner as a raging narcissist, but the person in question would think they're perfectly okay and not see a problem. They would not report anything as wrong. And why am I saying this? Because I worked in GIDS at the Tavistock in 2004 and became extremely concerned about the rapid medicalisation of children, where I witnessed certain team members deciding that it would be okay for children to be sent to receive powerful drugs to interfere with their normal, healthy hormonal systems and their physical development. I'm not going to go into the story today of how that unfolded, because I think most of you are aware of the judicial review and the subsequent CAS review, which we're talking about. But when I raised concerns in the GIDS, I discovered that my freedom of thought, connected to really 30 years at that stage of mental health experience, was questioned. I was told to think very carefully about what I was saying and what I was writing in the medical notes. And it eventually led to a sense of being told that I should not have the freedom for clinical thought, because it would lead me and the service into trouble. And at that stage, it was largely external forces, but the charities and the transactivism. But it's grown, and I think it's from within the NHS and clinical services all round now. So I left the service, but there was a report after I whistle blew. There was a report, and one of the things that were flagged up was that there needed to be more research, clinical scrutiny, that the GIDS didn't have an ethical framework, and at that time, I'm not sure if they used the word ethical, but they didn't have a clinical framework. But the report was buried and forgotten. So the human mind likes to have certainty. It hates doubt and fear. It tries to disconnect from pain, and that goes for most of us. There are connections I would make between the children who are caught up in a self-diagnosis of their trans identity, because they have minds that will not allow them full freedom of thought. And it tends to lead to a censoring of speech, both their own, but importantly, the adults and other family members around them, and the clinicians that they come into contact with. And that's sort of why I mentioned the idea of the importance of a holistic and 360-degree view of the people who present with gender identity issues, particularly the younger people. So working as a psychotherapist, one walks a line between both demonstrating to your patient that you have empathy and some understanding of what they're experiencing, but also one needs a freedom of thought, a part of the mind that can enter into a conversation with your immediate experience with the patient. For example, I might find myself feeling very sad or very irritated, or alternatively hopeless, useless during a consultation. In that situation, I try to link with a third space in my mind that allows a triangulation for me to think about their experience, my experience, and how we might explore and understand these feelings together. It is tentative, cautious, sometimes bold or risky, but a good clinician is watching for the impact of their words on the patient and trying to keep curiosity alive whilst protecting the patient from too much psychological exposure. I believe that a conversion therapy ban, which we'll probably talk about later, to include transgender patients will scare most therapists and clinicians away from attempting this work. One is trying to model a kind of a model of the mind where you're safe to explore and question things in your own mind. So what's gone wrong in this area of medical ethics? Well, so much, but I will stick to my area. The reason the so-called affirmation model, which leads to a collusion of agreement and unquestioning route for the trans-identified person, is so persuasive and convincing for many, in my understanding, is that the patients, their parents and professionals all find it hard to remain emotionally connected when there is severe pain. Psychological distress. You need resilience and support to hold out for curiosity and understanding. So much it's easier to move towards the answer. I'm aware I've got to finish, so I'll just quickly scan through. The reason I'm saying this is important is because I think that there is an ethical problem when there seems to be what is termed an easy answer. And I think what we've got to hold out for is encouraging the patients to feel brave enough to explore and understand what their conflicts are, what their pain is about. The problem is if medication is on offer to children and clinicians, it's so much easier to give in to that. So I'll hold things there and maybe come back to the other points that I had said.
My background is in pediatric nursing, and I have a graduate degree in bioethics. So I have a keen interest in the conversation today around the crisis in medical ethics. I want to start by having a thought experiment. We've all been on a plane before. Flight's getting ready to land. You're watching this great movie, and you have about 10 minutes left in the movie, and you're hoping you get to finish the movie before the flight ends. And you're an accountant. And the flight attendant announces that we have a CPA on the plane. He's got to do a big presentation and he needs some help with a spreadsheet. and you ignore the call because you want to finish your movie. But imagine it's a doctor. He's watching the movie and he's got 10 minutes to finish the movie. And the flight attendant says, we have a medical emergency. We think we have a patient having a heart attack. Is there anybody on the plane that can help? Well, can you imagine if that physician opted to just sit in the chair, finish his movie? And then the next day the news reported that somebody died on a plane and there was a doctor on the plane who didn't make himself known. We rightfully expect our physicians to have a moral obligation. They have a duty. They're duty bound. If you read the Hippocratic Oath, they swear an allegiance, a covenant. They take this do no harm, promise, oath very seriously. Aristotle said that the end of the medical art is health. I say the reason we have a crisis in medicine today and a crisis in medical ethics is we've forgotten the aims and the goals and the ends of medicine. It's always been oriented to health. The psychological health, the mental health, the physical health. It's not been oriented to providing services. It's not been oriented to being driven by activism, advocacy. It's not been oriented to an ideological quest. It's been rooted in do no harm. There was a GP on the panel I was on, in the audience on a panel I was on in this room right before, and she asked, why is it that doctors are behaving badly? And I say it's because they forgot what their job is. They forgot their duty. They forgot the purposes of medicine. Why is medicine considered an art? When I was a nurse, I remember working at the University of California, San Francisco. It's a big teaching hospital. The cardiologists would come in doing morning rounds with the residents and the interns, and the residents and interns would look at clipboards and they'd rattle off data, lab values, chest x-ray results. But the attending physician would say, have you looked at the patient? Have you touched the patient's skin? Are they hot? Are they sweaty? Are they cold? Are they clammy? What's the color of their eyes? Are their lips dry? These are the things that the artist does. The artist explores and imagines and investigates, and it's this whole inquiry that it's not data driven. It's not. So doctors are not service providers, and that's what we see in gender affirmation therapy. I think I'm trapped in the wrong body. I'm a boy who wants to be a girl. Okay, I'll chop off your penis. I'll remove your breasts. Doctors are not technicians. That's what the guy at the auto shop does. And when he changes your oil and rotates your tires, they're not activists. Doctors aren't to overprescribe. They are to treat, to heal, and whenever possible, to restore health, especially in the case of elderly and aging. So first, do no harm. I often recall that I speak to so many people who will say they know that Hippocrates said, do no harm. Everybody knows that, right? Raise your hand if you know that, do no harm. But how many people have actually read the oath? And the oath is thousands of years old. It's less than 400 words. So it's not a challenge to read it. But it's really stood the test of time. And if you look, maybe we can talk about that later, but if you look at the modern ethical theories that are governing medicine, they're woefully inadequate, which is why we have this problem on our hands with gender affirmation therapy only approaches. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you for having me. I'm Margaret McCartney. I'm a GP in Glasgow and I'm an academic at St Andrews University. My research interest is in conflicts of interest in medicine. My long-standing interest has been in overdiagnosis and overtreatment, and you can probably see why I'm interested in this, because evidence-based medicine is my watchword. That's the only reason why I think anyone should pay any attention to doctors is if they make a commitment to talking about evidence and offering information and care for you that's based on evidence. And why is that? Well, if we don't use evidence, we inadvertently harm and kill people. So you may have heard of Dr. Spock, a doctor in the 1960s who sold millions of books worldwide and told patients from a position of kindness and authority that babies were safer when put to sleep on their front because any vomit that they brought up would surely therefore not be inhaled. And of course, we now know that that was dangerous and harmful advice, and we tell parents to put their kids back to sleep because they have a lower risk of sudden infant death if they do. There's just an example of what seemed quite sensible and compassionate and caring advice turned out actually to be deadly advice. And that's why I think doctors have to make a very strong commitment to practicing evidence-based medicine, even when it seems counterintuitive, sort of silly, dangerous. I remember learning that screening for breast cancer wasn't actually all it was cracked up to be. And I remember thinking, why? How? And it was a revelation, I suppose, that what seemed to be like quite a straightforward thing, find something early, that will help, actually turned out to be counterintuitive and difficult. So I've been a GP now for quite a long time, and the pattern that I started to notice in the last decade or so was something that I'd felt I'd seen before, and I'd seen before in a different form in terms of anorexia and in terms of self-harm, cutting behaviours. And the pattern was that of young adolescent women hating their bodies and growing up in a society where sexual harassment and misogyny absolutely endemic. The pressure on the way to look or to be or to feel as a female was just oppressive. And I felt as though there was something very similar happening in what was the phenomena of young women in particular saying that they hated their bodies and they wanted to identify as male, or they were a male, or they were really a boy. And I was really frightened by this because I didn't know how to understand it, and it seemed to be following a pattern that I'd seen before. And I looked to the literature to see what was going on and what was happening. Now, in medicine over the last decade or so, there's been a strong tradition of patient partnership, and much of that has been fantastic. Patients come to an arrangement with doctors, you have discussions about the evidence, work out, try to help each other. What are the questions that patients have? How best should we answer them? But something quite different was happening here, in that I was being told what to think by various lobby groups who had inserted themselves into various aspects of medical institutions and organisations, but critically didn't have an evidence base that I could go back and check and find out whether what they were saying was actually true or not. And the message was that if I didn't immediately affirm individuals as being in their chosen gender, I was actively doing harm. Now, most people go into medicine because they want to do good things, and the idea that you might be causing harm to your patients by your attitude is really quite frightening. And when I came to this originally, I was concerned about it, and then I became quite angry and upset about it when I discovered that the Royal College of GPs had taken £11,000 from an organisation who put an educational platform into the RCGP learning website that said if you don't immediately affirm people in their chosen gender, you will be contributing to harm for them. And I was so outraged about this and the lack of evidence for it. It did eventually get removed, but it was quite a bruising experience. And at that point, I realised just how many people had some awareness that there wasn't much evidence going on here. There may well be harms that are going on, but we're afraid to speak up. Now, I have written for a long time in the lay press, and I always consider it a privilege to be published and not a right. But for the first time in my professional life, the usual left-wing outlets I would quite often write for would not accept anything questioning or raising issues or concerns in this. And that made me even more frightened because I was worried that we were making a category error. I've written a paper which is freely available in the British Journal of General Practice about what we've termed delicate diagnoses, which are diagnoses that occur in society, but which are massively influenced by what's going on elsewhere. So pharmaceutical lobbying groups, provision of private practice, single issue groups. I'm sure you can think of lots of areas of medicine which fall into these categories and where diagnostic rates and the treatments that we offer for them are not predicated by what's the evidence on something, but it's predicated by what's happening externally, the pressures that put on doctors to prescribe. I'm going to close over because I saw that yellow card. But in general, I kind of disagree a bit. I don't think we've forgotten ethics. I think that the problem is that doctors are being filtered through this message that the ethical thing is to go around the gender affirmation and treatment route. They're kind of hearing that that's the ethical thing to do. But I think we need to raise the evidence hand and say, well, actually, the evidence is telling us something very difficult and very different. I believe that most people in healthcare are trying to do their best. There's always going to be bad actors. But I do believe that the majority of people out there do have similar concerns and are finding it hard to raise them. And I see my job here as trying to support people to raise concerns in helpful and constructive ways so that we can get people the care and attention that they need and which is evidence-based. Thank you.
Hi there. I'm Stella O'Malley, a psychotherapist and director of GenSpect. And I suppose I do think mental health has really lost its way in many ways. It's not just gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria has revealed a real distress in the heart of the psychological industry, which is what it's become, and the well-being industry. And I think it's very important that we realise how difficult anybody who gets into the caring professions, whether they're a doctor, a psychiatrist, psychotherapist, how helpless we feel in a world that is seeking certainty and diagnosis and frameworks and treatment paths and a result, to be faced with the helplessness of some people are very difficult to help, and some people don't seem to be able to be helped. And what do we as a world do about that fact? Hopefully we don't fall into the many examples we've seen here of unethical treatment. But that is, I think, very often the reason why so many people who are in psychiatric professions who do fall into unethical treatment, because they want to help. And I saw a man on the way here, and he was clearly extremely distressed. Like, really, it was kind of horrifying to watch it. And you could see anybody who was walking by didn't quite know what to do. One person got out their phone and started filming. And in a way, you lighten it because you don't know what to do. That utter sense of helplessness in the face of profound mental distress that nobody has figured out what to do. But we are living in a world that's very results orientated, and all the kind of all the services are around the results, and we have got ourselves into a really difficult situation where people are seeking results, and if there isn't results, who's to blame? And so when we look at that and we realise what we're doing to people who are very, very in deep distress and they need help, we need, I suppose, as a profession, whether a psychiatrist, psychotherapist, psychologist, nurse, doctor, we need to start to have the freedom to say, I don't think I can help this person. I don't know who can. I don't think I can. And when we've got the courage and the moral courage to do that, it'll free things up a little bit. But it's going to be devastating for the people who are the recipients of this. And that's not what's happening these days. Instead, people are getting bounced from one person to the next person, from one service to the next service. And that's a real kind of moral conundrum that we are facing, that we need to look at and think, well, that's actually what we need to face. The fact that people are coming to us and we don't know what to do and we're helpless in a world that says you're not allowed to say those sentences. And so I kind of think we do have to lean into that. Maybe the battle of ideas will lean into it. But I do want to kind of give a shout out of some of the other scandals we've lost our way in the psych professions before. An obvious one would be multiple personality disorder, where, in a time of huge sexual politics in the 1980s and 1990s, there was a kind of a theory, because psychiatry is generally, clusters of symptoms. It's a very incoherent discipline. It's clusters of symptoms, and then there's a theory in hindsight laid onto this cluster of symptoms, be they depression or anxiety or schizophrenia or whatever they are. And so this recovered memory therapy was based on the idea that children had sexual abuse, but they'd completely forgotten about it. And then they had multiple personality disorder later on. And there's an interesting psychiatrist, he's still alive, he's 93, called Paul McHugh. And he had chased John Money around Johns Hopkins Hospital from kind of 1966 to 1978, because he noticed that John Money, who is a disgrace, and I urge you to look him up if you don't know who he is, he was performing and creating this entire clinic and industry around transsexual, at the time it was called, transsexual surgeries. And Paul McHugh was realising that these people were not improving. They were deeply disturbed, very, very mentally ill people who were not improving. And so he followed it, and in the end he got Johns Hopkins closed, and it closed in 1978 as a result of the very bad results of these people who had trans surgeries and did not improve. They just had other sicknesses. By the way, later on it reopened in 2014. But Paul McHugh then went on to become involved with multiple personality disorder, and he was part of the foundation of the false memory syndrome. And he kind of highlighted the idea that this kind of idea of recovered memory was a very dubious theory of people faced with deep distress, and they brought in a theory. And I would say it's very similar to the trans theory insofar as we could easily have false identity syndrome. And we could easily start kind of looking into this. This is a false identity. It's a syndrome. It's a cluster of symptoms. And I could easily bring up a theory. Any one of us could bring up a theory. I've got the red card. But what I'm trying to do, I suppose, more than anything is, yes, we know there have been many, many medical scandals, psychiatric scandals before. And what we have to do is start facing the fact that sometimes we can't help. And we have a real dilemma on where we go from there. Thank you.
Thanks. I just really didn't want to stop them. But I think that sets the scene for a discussion. I'm going to come straight out to you guys for your questions. And we've got a lot of them, so keep them brief. I just wanted to mention a couple of things before we go out to the audience. Things to think about, perhaps, or how did we get here? What's the role for the public in these medical scandals? How did doctors lose their way? Why did doctors lose their way? And is it as simple as the money that is spent? So with that, I will take the arm with the green jumper there.
I have asked questions of this Battle of Ideas last year, and to other events. You know that I'm a trans widow. I am concerned whether it would be useful to pursue the individuals who condemned my now dead trans ex-husband, and I name them Dr. James Barrett, Mr. Philip Thomas, who's now dead, I understand, and an unknown endocrinologist. As a member of the public, if I were not emotionally involved in this, I would be very interested to know to what extent they are professionally negligent or some kind of cult follower. Do you discuss, please? Thank you.
So just one step, much of evidence was discussed. I remember there's this, I'm a psychiatrist, and you're a psychiatrist in Canada who claimed to also be a philosopher and had written that evidence-based psychiatry is unethical. And I have heard it a lot here too. So it's kind of something, a systematic move. And I think the crisis in medical ethics is that medicine is at the grip of an ideological capture, and they redefines the whole ethical parameters. What is harm? It's totally redefined. And I think root of it is, again, a lot of people disagree with me, and it's kind of a relativism that has crept itself into medicine. That now is whatever we say, and now we can easily redefine what harm is. So if you do not affirm, it is harm. But surgery and all the side effects, not harm. Thank you.
It's a question about your experience. I was wondering how many people came to you having diagnosed themselves already as being trans, because it must be one thing to be a doctor who is responding to someone who says, "What's the matter with me? Please give me your expertise." And somebody else who comes saying, "I'm trans, will you help me do something about it?"
I've got a friend who's has a 17-year-old granddaughter, and she's been sent testosterone in the post by Gender GP. I'm sure you've heard of them. She's paid them £800 and has taken it. Her voice has already deepened. She's 17, lives in the UK. Is this legal? And is there anything my friend can do to report this?
Yeah, thank you. So doctors should do no harm, but it also seems to me institutions and teachers should do no harm. But they are doing harm. My trade union is ignoring CAS. It's the NEU, by the way. The General Secretary is very happy to posture about Palestine, Tommy Robinson, posture against an imaginary far right, but won't look at reality in the face when it comes to giving guidance to teachers, because in terms of how they should respond. And this is dangerous for the teachers. They shouldn't be in that position where they've got no guidance, but they've got none. It's just being totally ignored. My union has finally nodded towards allowing gender-critical speech. But if you say it in a way that upsets a trans person, you fall foul of their definition of transphobia. So this is having a really big effect on kids. It's not just medical malpractice, which is the problem. It's institutions and hopeless unions like my own, and that really needs to be fought.
Since we've now after all these last 10 years, got to terms with this amazing phenomenon of trans, while we're there, can we just look a little bit further ahead and see what is further down the road? If you are somebody who has taken cross-sex hormones and possibly had surgery, you have massively reduced your fertility. When in a few years' time you come to want to have a child, people are going to suggest that you might need to use surrogacy. And I know there's something that Jennifer's done a lot of work on. We should be looking at the links so that we see what these pharmaceutical companies and all the professions that make money out of exploiting people are looking at next. Another example, tiny piece in the Daily Mail today. Sorry, I've got to confess, I read it. Apparently there's a huge outbreak in young people going for major cosmetic surgery on their faces, specifically because tweakments, which have now become practically routine, are going wrong. I mean, when I saw my neighbour's lip had slipped, I politely averted my eyes, but we see it everywhere. So while we're here, let's look a little bit further ahead and think what we're going to have to battle next.
So in the UK, we've got higher rates of diagnosis of mental health problems in general than ever before. And we've also got higher rates of prescriptions for psychiatric medication than ever before. And that seems really counterintuitive because if the drugs work, we would assume that the rates of mental illness would go down. I think with gender conditions, because the treatments are so dire and they have such a radical effect on people's bodies, it's very noticeable and people pay attention. But in fact, things like antidepressants have quite terrible side effects and can cause withdrawal effects and things like that. So could the panel speak to the kind of ethical crisis in mental health more broadly?
Great. There's a person behind you with, I guess you all have green bands, but
thank you. I'd like to ask a question coming out from the recommendations of the CAS review. So CAS is suggesting a research project for young children who are on puberty blockers. And I'd like to ask the panel what their thoughts are on how you ethically construct a research project, given that we know that there's an absence of data on children because the Tavistock refused to collect it, and how you construct a project when we know that there is significant evidence of harm to those children.
I don't remember who mentioned it, maybe a few of you, but just on back to medicine and how it's gone bad and what's doing good look like. What I see, and I saw this in the shifts that I worked in clinical nursing, was that doctors gave way, ceded their profession to becoming technicians and service providers. When I started nursing, we had doctors and nurses and patients. When I left nursing, we had customers and clients. In America, I don't know if it's the case in the United Kingdom, it's very common after you've had a visit to your hospital, a stay in your hospital, a visit to your GP, you get an email on how was your service and rate it. Were you happy? Were you pleased? So I think that's a huge problem. Medicine also ceded its authority and expertise, and I mean those words in a good way, by committee. So hospital administrators now say how medicine is going to be conducted in a certain facility. Insurance providers have their voice in the equation of what we're going to do and how medicine's going to be practiced. Lawyers, of course, so it's now practiced by committee instead of just the physician who, again, knows his moral duty to do no harm and to treat the patient in front of them. So I think that's been a big shift. To the CAS report, I will speak to Jan's comments about what's coming down the pike. I'm not an expert in the long CAS report, but I do know because I read it with the eye of fertility preservation. And we know now that trans-identifying youth are offered to freeze and bank their egg and sperm before they go on cross-sex hormones and have surgery. So if they want to have a biologically related child down the road, and even Dr. Cass wasn't critical of that, but if I'm recalling correctly, she was just asking for a standard protocol for how fertility preservation is offered. I have a paper that's through peer review that's probably going to be published hopefully before the end of the year, which looks at fertility preservation as it's currently being practiced. And the only comparison model we have is pediatric cancer patients. So before chemo and radiation is started, they're offered to freeze and bank their eggs. And it's highly experimental and has a very high failure rate. So my concern is that children that are being offered to freeze and bank their eggs before cross-sex hormones and gender surgeries are being sold a bill of goods. So,
yeah, thanks for these great questions. I agree in many ways with what you were just saying. There's been a massive shift over my kind of 30 years or so of practice in a loss of medical authority. And some of that's been good because it was about eminence-based medicine rather than evidence-based medicine. But the problem is that we've given over so much power to areas that I don't think deserve it because they don't have evidence of benefits. So, for example, doctors have to have 360-degree appraisal when, people working around them are given forms to fill in and say how good or bad they think that doctor is. I have seen careers being destroyed, junior doctors being absolutely destroyed over comments that have been made by a professional about them anonymously. Patient feedback forms, we have to do that. Every 5 years, people can write what they want. Google reviews, your practice gets reviewed. There are websites where people can review GPs' approach to gender. For example, that's online. So there's a massive customer culture, and that feeds into this kind of very postmodern idea about self-identifying diagnoses. And you can't challenge that. If somebody says how they feel, that's how they feel. Where it becomes problematic in medicine is if that feeling translates into a professional need for me to do something, which is when I think it becomes fractured and when doctors should say no. The issue for medicine is how does medicine as an organisation in all its different facets, how does that deal with a professional that says, I think there's a problem here? And we haven't done it well at all, obviously. In this area, we have ostracised doctors who have spoken up about the lack of evidence. Professionals have libelled other professionals. Again, we've made it very difficult for people to progress in organisations where they've had views that evidence should lead first. And the question for organisations is, how do we deal with that next? I'd written an article for the BMJ not that long ago saying that all healthcare organisations should do a critical instant review about what they did up to the CAST report. Did they contribute towards the problems that CAST had identified, or did they contribute towards solving them? I'm not aware of any medical organisation who's taken up what I thought was a brilliant offer, but it's the kind of thing that I think that medical professionals could ask their organisation to do. We've got this report out now, this independent report. What role did our organisation play in that, and how would we do better the next time?
I would say, again, there are so many things here that I'd like to say, but just on this issue about the further research, in my experience, so I've not met every child, but in my experience, I've been meeting a lot of children in this area. I don't think I've come across anyone that I felt should proceed to hormones. I think kids are just too young to understand really what they're doing at that stage. I know that's a very unpopular opinion in some areas, but that's my experience. But the other thing I would say is we have a raft in this country of kids who've been through the Tavistock GID service and they haven't been followed up. And before I want to give a single child, new child, any kind of non-evidence-based research medication, I think we should pressure the government to allow the adult services, which many of these children have now moved into. And I think we should have a thorough review of what has happened to the children who've already been put into this.
That information, of course, the adult clinics refuse to give to the CAST review.
Yeah, exactly.
Just quickly on 3 points. The gender GP, it is legal for gender GP to send out cross-sex hormones. This is a huge issue for me that puberty blockers have been dealt with, cross-sex hormones haven't, and they are nobody's in any doubt that the effects of cross-sex hormones are irreversible and they're lifelong effects. So that's a real problem. The NHS, in their response to the CAST review, did say that they were going to do a full review of cross-sex hormones, similar to the puberty blockers review. That seems to have been dropped. It's disappeared now. So I don't know. I know that, I mean, what we've been told is that once a child, this is bloody Gillick competence again, once a child gets to 16, it's more difficult. So we've asked about why cross-sex hormones are going to be given without a clinical trial. But so, yeah, and which leading on to the puberty blockers trial, this is for the, I think this, looking at it, it's for the advancement of medicine. You can't ethically do, and the trial is now being called a study, which is very worrying. But I don't see how you can get ethical approval for a trial that one of the things they're experimenting in is they're finding out if it affects children's brain development. I mean, you can't advance medicine by experimenting on children. So everyone needs to be keeping an eye open for that. And on the issue of schools, I mean, it's another thing why this area is so different to any other medical area, because it's not actually a medical area. It's a political, cultural, social area that somehow has been transferred into medicine, but it's everywhere. And the gender affirming model that I think if we were to sum up the Cass review, it was that the gender affirmation model has been discredited and has caused harm. And yet it's being used in schools and nobody is looking at, the huge psychological influence of a teacher telling a girl that she's a boy. I mean, it's ridiculous that, as Cass pointed out, this is an active intervention, which teachers are not qualified to do.
Just to kind of reiterate Stephanie's point about puberty blockers, it's not ethical to block the sexual development and cognitive and physical development of children. We figured that out, after the Nuremberg trials. It's well established. So this sort of barbaric experimentation we need to be kind of very foursquare and very, very clear in our minds that sort of radical invasive experimentation on children is profoundly unethical. There has been kind of extraordinary interventions carried out on children. That doesn't mean that it should have happened. It's like in plain sight. There's no way it doesn't stack up as an ethical intervention. To Carrie Clark's point about the rates of mental health continuing to soar, even though we keep on throwing psychiatric medication at people. Abigail Schreier, detailed this very well in her book, Bad Therapy, and she discussed, interventions for breast cancer and put them with, interventions for mental health and showed how really we did very well with breast cancer. Like we kept on putting in interventions and we, followed the results and we got the best treatment. And this lack of follow-up and the lack of honesty in admitting that they're not working out. We seem to be going the wrong direction in our interventions, and we need a kind of a review of frankly the entire mental health well-being industry, because it's really lost its way. About the 17-year-old, just to finish, and the cross-sex hormones and gender GP, yet again hiding in plain sight. Like online, scurrilous, unethical providers of hormones. We're going to look back and think, how did we not all collectively just, go take to the streets on this? But as we know, this is a complex issue that you need like hours and hours to try and get your point across to. And so we are kind of, obviously, we're making great gains, but it's very important that we are clear-sighted in the barbaric treatments that are ongoing.
Hello, Sue. Your fellow rabble-rouser. Oh, sorry. Susan and I overlapped at GIDS, and we were the terrible duo causing trouble. What's clear is that there's the external homophobia and the internal autism for lots of these kids, and the homophobia can be institutional, familial. One of my patients was one of the first people to have a sex change because he was gay in South Africa in the 60s. His mother said, there's no way you're going to be gay in South Africa. You're going to have a sex change at 16. So that was external. The former CEO of Mermaids has gone on, TED Talks and talked about how she was worried that her son was going to be, who was at camp, was going to be gay. And you know what happened there. And I've said this to the room before, so apologies for repetition. But when I said to the founder of GIDS, hang on, these 5-year-olds coming in, they're just camp boys and they're just tomboy girls. They're surely just going to end up being gay. Isn't what you're doing mad? And he said, is it any more mad than if they were gay? So this was the institutional homophobia, where it was better to trans them into a heterosexual normal person than to allow them to just carry on and be gay. My point. And as just one point about the research, I think it's totally unethical, the research for puberty blockers, castration agents, because no child can give informed consent to the high risk of anorgasmia, the inability to have sexual orgasms later in life, if as a prepubescent child they've never had one, they don't know what it is. They can't give informed consent to never have something that they've never had or have an understanding of. So I say, with the absence of informed consent from the children, it's absolutely not possible.
Yeah, I wanted to mention NHS computers. I work in NHS and all our systems have been changed basically to a system of self-ID. Anybody can change their sex, anybody can put a wrong name on, and then we have to try and track them through their NHS number. Our admin have to try and find them. That was never allowed in the past. And the bit that makes me angry is to be a nurse, you have to be registered with Nurse and Midwifery Council, which I am. So I can't leave them. I can't say, I don't want anything to do with you. But they've colluded with this. They haven't stopped it. And then they've issued a standard which basically says that if you misgender anyone, you can be disciplined. So I feel if you're like a young nurse on a ward, you suspect that a female is actually a male. All the medical records and the computers all say she's a male. She's using a male name. You think there's going to be an error made here, but if you open your mouth and say anything, you can then be disciplined. And to me, it's pure gaslighting. And I've written to them on at least 2 occasions now, asking them who is responsible if a medical error is made by us all having to pretend someone is a different sex. They simply don't respond. If I ask them about their membership of Stonewall, they simply deny it affects them. And I feel professionals are being put in a ridiculous position whereby we're expected to collude with this. I've personally seen a case where a girl took an overdose, ended up in our system. I read the referral. The day later, it was changed to a boy's name and she was recorded as a male. And you're thinking, no, if I hadn't seen it before, then I wouldn't know that this is a confused child, possibly traumatised. We know from the CARS report, a lot of these girls, they're autistic, they're traumatised and all this stuff. But this information is now being withheld. And I wondered how the panel feel about that.
I'm a member of Thoughtful Therapists and also, unfortunately, of the BACP, which is the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy. What do we do about organisations like the BACP, which have yet even to acknowledge the CAS review? BACP is currently reformulating their ethical framework. Already, we are supposed to operate under the Memorandum of Understanding, which is broadly affirmative. This is likely now to be incorporated into the ethical framework. We already heard earlier from Az Hakim how a lot of the Royal Colleges are captured. What do we as professionals, just going about our daily work? I've been a school counsellor for 5 years. I've worked daily with these sorts of children. What do we do about our professional bodies?
Hi, I have a friend who was enjoying the post-conference social at WPATH, and she's a quite well-respected medical ethicist in a Russell Group university. So I can't believe that the whole area of academic medical ethics is not analysing, let's say, competence, ability to make decisions. So, and it was just a general comment, and if you've got any points where I can talk to her, but also what's going on in university medical ethics departments.
First of all, I want to say the admiration I have for the panel for standing up and being seen. It takes incredible bravery. I'm a mental health professional, psychotherapist. I am silenced. I know I should stand against the Memorandum of Understanding, but I want to get a paper published. And I know that paper will do a lot of people a lot of good. And if I make a stand, my chances of being published will go down.
Hey, thank you. I'm a psychotherapist here in London. I hear the points about WPATH being a kind of political, activist, ideological organisation, but as the point has already been made, so is the BACP, British, so is the BPS, British Psychological Society. Natalie Bailey, the chair of the BACP, is very much in thrall of this ideology, which so many of our institutions are now. And so this ideology that we can, WPATH can seem like an extreme organisation, but this ideology is spreading. And what's spreading is, I think, this notion that binaries, in this case, that everybody is either male or female, needs to be deconstructed. And the point being to cause confusion and to disrupt, because if you undermine the concepts in society that provide certainty, then everything's kind of at play, and this ideology says that certainty is oppressive. What you need to do is get rid of oppression. I find this in psychotherapy training courses all the time. So you'll talk to other students about their dissertation, and so many of them are writing their dissertation on therapy as revolution.
Yeah, hi. I'm a historian, and it seems to me that the panel have a slightly exalted idea of the objectivity of their own disciplines. I mean, in a secular society, psychology's for a long time taken on the mantle of aligning authoritatively behavior and values and identity by establishing what's normal, natural, and healthy. But their opinion on what constitutes this shifts to reflect public opinion more than the facts, You go back to drapetomania, running away slaves, history with women being gay, all of these were pathologized. If you look at your own concept now of gender dysphoria, this recently transitioned itself from gender identity disorder into gender dysphoria, perfectly reflecting the new paradigm's empathetic presentation of it rather than pathologizing it. Do you not ever worry that you are simply on the wrong side of history here, and your resistance just simply reflects the friction as the paradigm shifts yet again?
So I suppose I just want to ask the question, what do we do as the general public when we feel, as Steve Levine said in the wonderful Wider Lens podcast, that the chain of trust is broken? How do we as the general public find some repair for that? And I would also say to any professionals in the room, you're in front of a panel of professionals. They all stood up. They didn't burst into flames. They haven't, been cast into the dungeons of anonymity. Be braver. Stand up, because people like me and my daughter need you to be braver.
So there's a hand behind you there.
Hi, yes, I'm a GP, and I find myself in a very difficult position with people who might come and see me and say that they're transgender and want a referral. The Royal College of General Practitioners tell me that I must refer swiftly, or I can't remember quite what the word is. What am I supposed to do? Because I am absolutely sure if I refer to an adult gender clinic, then they're on the pathway to wrong sex hormones and potentially wrong sex treatments and all kinds of damage. Because I know they're not going to get the psychological support they need. Why is it left to me as a GP, a non-expert, as the gatekeeper to this? And what can I do about it? And yes, I am here speaking also for Seen in Health. Please come and join us if you're in the medical, or if you're in the NHS.
two or three. I'll try and be fairly quick on each one because there are so many interesting questions there. I suppose I'm not sure I quite understood what your question was to us. I think you were sort of saying, are we archaic and old-fashioned? Was that right, or?
Well, not necessarily. As I said, psychology has always followed sociological appeals. Rather than
Yes. So I think just speaking, all I can do is talk about my own clinical experience. I'm fully aware that psychiatry is a fashion business and it is broad brushstrokes. We kind of give diagnoses because it gives us a sort of a ballpark area to work in and to understand what we might do to help our patients. The reason I'm so passionate about these kids in particular, but also the young adults that I see, is because I think they're just struggling with their identity in a world that is changing very fast. They're the first real generation to have to cope with social media and growing up with social media. And so I think my plea is to say we need to assess carefully so we try and understand where these kids are coming from and what's troubling them and why they have such a problem being themselves in today's world. And I would say that's mental health for anyone. So kind of have a sense of who you are. Can you work? Can you love? That's it for me. So I hope, from my perspective, I've sort of answered your question, probably haven't, but there we are. The other thing I'd say is just briefly, I don't know if I'm allowed to do this, but I'm currently in discussion because I learned that the British Psychoanalytic Council, which is my registering body for psychotherapy and psychoanalysts, recently held a sort of an event on Cass, but she had to leave early, and I understand that there was then a discussion about all the things she got wrong in her 4 years of research, but no one was allowed to talk. So I've contacted Jan McMarish, and I don't know if she'll be cross with me. I'm trying to organise with her a freedom of speech union event for psychotherapists and clinicians. So that's hopefully going to be in the offing. So keep an eye on that. And the one I've talked too much. There was one other thing.
Go for it.
So someone was asking about what can we do. I don't think there are easy answers. The reason I eventually, back in 2019, decided I wanted to take a judicial review is not because I love lawyers or the stress that case involved, but I felt the NHS just were not listening. So I think the answer is to try as hard as you can. I whistle-blew within the NHS, and there was a review, but it got ignored. And at that point in 2019, where the Tavistock still said, after all those new whistleblowers came forward, still said, we're a careful service, we do careful assessment, there's nothing to see here. I just thought, okay, it's got to go outside the NHS and it's got to go to the law, which then led to news articles and Hannah Barnes reporting on it in Newsnight and so on. So I think opening it up in other areas is one way. I'm not saying I love the law, but anyway, that's just an option. I think you have to think outside the box if the box isn't working.
I just want to get back to that wrong side of history thing because we're accused of that a lot, and I don't think it's a helpful way of looking at it because I think every era has its symptom pool that that conditions are co-created by society and the medical profession, and the symptom pool at the moment is telling very young people and children this is the way to interpret those feelings. It's one way of interpreting feelings, and it happens to be trans at this point in history. But that will change, and it always does. I don't think there's a point where you can say this side of history is right and this side of history is wrong. It's always more complicated than that. On the issue of captured activists, GPs, universities, researchers, etc., I think certainly the NHS needs to root them out because they are working against the Cass review right now in clinics in the UK. NHS England is embedded with activist clinicians who with links to WPATH. I think it's going to take political action, but that's got to change.
I just bring expanding there on Stephanie's point about wrong side of history, etc. You know, we've never before medicalised identities, and it's an extraordinary thing to do. You know, I'm Irish and I could seek to medicalise my identity. We've never done it before, and we need to really pause and have a think about what actually is happening, because these identities are expanding. It started obviously with, you know, trans, and now it's moved into non-binary, and it's gone further. There's all sorts of identities that are coming out, like Therians and things like that. And it's the same concept, it's expanding into it. And, you know, Ian Hacking, you know, wrote about this so well when he's talked about making up people. That was way back in 1986. And we're making up people here, and we're medicalising those people. And there's a collusion going on whereby people are nodding along very seriously, because we're in this identitarian age where we have to take people's identity so seriously that if they want to change it, they can medicalise it and really harm their health in the process. But there's another collusion going on that I'm very uncomfortable with. If you knew, I'm a psychotherapist, I'm based in Ireland. If you knew how many psychotherapists based in Ireland have emailed me, messaged me in various different ways to explain to me that they're a psychotherapist based in Ireland and they can't speak up. And they say phrases like, and you know well why. And I'm like, no, I don't actually. I don't at all. I think it's unethical not to speak up. I think it's unethical to work in a profession where you're well paid and you have to abide by certain standards and you don't speak up. And I do think at this stage, now we're post-Cass, I don't think there's any, it doesn't hold water at this stage. So you can have freedom of conscience and you can object and you will get papers published. There might be different papers to the one that you want to get published, but you can speak up, and frankly, ethically, you should speak up, or you certainly shouldn't do any harm.
So I just wanted to speak to the lady, the nurse up on the balcony who'd mentioned about computer records and things. I completely agree. It's a safety issue, primarily. To be allowed to change your sex marker because you feel as though you're a different gender is a safety issue, because it means that all your blood test results, your screening invitations, your imaging, everything is being categorised as the opposite sex, which isn't safe. And that's not good for anybody. And we wouldn't have allowed the pharmaceutical industry to come in and say, for example, we want to reduce these numbers, we want to change this because that looks better for us. It's a really wild idea, to be absolutely honest with you. And the RCGP policy is to ask for separate sex and gender markers on records, which, you know, I think is a reasonable step. You know, if somebody's desperate to change a gender marker, at least we can say, well, there is an alternative to that, and you have to explain why that alternative is not at least as good. You could argue not to change it at all, perfectly valid argument, but there should be other system issues that can be done from a safety point of view, no matter where you're coming from on this issue. Someone mentioned about medical ethics departments and how we deal with them. The thing with ethicists who are arguing for postmodern ideas is that they believe that they are acting ethically. I would argue that in medical ethics, and I would argue that in medicine, you can only act ethically if you're also acting with evidence. And if you don't have evidence, or you don't question your need for evidence, or you don't look to identify the uncertainty, to reduce the uncertainty, you are acting unethically. So I think that we have to talk about evidence in the ethics bundle here. It doesn't act alone. You know, it's the actions that we're doing. In terms of being on the wrong side of history, I worry all the time about everything, constantly. So I definitely worry that I'm on the wrong side of history, but I don't think I am, because I have looked very carefully at the evidence base. I have seen massive gaps in the evidence, and I've seen people acting as though they do have evidence in this space to the detriment of many people. And until people can demonstrate to me that that gap has been filled and that they have good outcomes, I'm going to continue to sit where I am. You can't just assume that what you're doing is in medicine, you know, no matter how ethically you think you're acting, unless you have the evidence. I am a broken record, but unless you have the evidence, you are not acting ethically, bottom line. And it doesn't matter where you sit politically on this, it doesn't matter what you're doing. If you don't have the evidence, you may as well be a homeopath. Just to the GP who was saying, I'm a non-expert GP, I'm going to change this around. GPs are GPs because we see the whole person. We don't specialise in one particular area. We can identify what's going on. We have very often known that person in their family, in their community, the whole life. We know what else is going on, what other mental health systems are maybe interacting with that child or that family. There has been an active disenfranchisement and fragmentation of primary care in the UK over the last 10 years. To massive detriment, because this is the kind of thing that we should be actually experts in.
I hate to beat the wrong side of history to death. But as it relates to medical ethics, we're not short on medical scandals historically. I mean, what happened in Nazi Germany was wrong. They were on the wrong side of history, and Nuremberg proved that. And whistleblowers let the world know what was happening in Nazi Germany. It was actually a Polish prisoner in one of the first concentration camps that was able to get the word out on what was happening. The gentleman who won the Nobel Prize for lobotomy surgeries was on the wrong side of history. And of course, lawsuits proved that he was on the wrong side of history. The Tuskegee studies in the United States on black men with syphilis that was a study on the wrong side of history, a medical study. And it was proven to be on the wrong side of history because President Clinton started paying reparations to the men that were still living that were part of the Tuskegee studies. And if they were not living, reparations were paid to their family members. Similarly, forced sterilization practices, which came from the United Kingdom, made their way into the United States. The doctors that were forcibly sterilizing people were on the wrong side of history. And again, reparations, my own state, Governor Gavin Newsom, who I'm no fan of, but he did pass a law a few years ago paying reparations. And the last woman in California was involuntarily sterilized in the early 2000s. She was an incarcerated woman. The people that were doing that were on the wrong side of history. So we're living right now, those of us who are fighting this, we're on the right side of history.
I just want to raise an issue around identity, because that seems to, we're medicalizing identity, but also I wonder if the identity of clinicians plays a role here, because it seems so widespread, and you have individuals who seem so invested in it. Is this not that we have we're medicalizing identity, but then we have people who have an identity as a medicalizer. So we are getting down to the end. Can I just see any last hands of people? Okay, I've got the gentleman in the front here.
Sorry to ask another question. Actually, it's a comments, but about influencing the organizations. No, we have to get inside and make noise. And that's what happened. I was telling Dr. Hakim earlier after the last session that finally Royal College of Psychiatrists endorsed Cass' report, although not as emphatically as I preferred, and they disengaged from Stonewall. But on the other hand, British Medical Association has now decided to have their own review on Cass, and people like me, all they can do is stop paying them, which I have done. Thanks.
Hello, I'm still a trans widow. I am still amazed that there is no espousal of morality, which is about a society. We are no man, no woman is an island. And there's, to my mind, a moral universe that all of us as professionals should be trying to pursue, please.
Why, thank you. I hear a lot of talk about ethics, none about consequences. Who performed all these questionable surgeries? It wasn't done by the Tavistock. These are named individuals. Why are they anonymous? Why can they not get on a stage and speak for what they have done?
Hi there. I would just like to ask, how
charity organisations, or more aptly named lobby groups, have managed to infiltrate the NHS and give guidance when they don't have any clinical experience. My ex-partner works for a charity, and he's assigned a collection of NHS trusts, and he tells them how they should treat these patients, what they should call them, what they should do, and presents statistics that are not from well-carried-out studies. How have we gotten to the point that NHS practices are listening to individuals with no qualifications, lobby groups?
I think I'm going to let the panel back to sum up now.
Yeah, to sum up, it was a good last comment there about consequences and about, like it's ongoing, as the last speaker spoke about, these charities are continuing to advise. It's extraordinary in this postcast world that everything didn't come to a shuddering halt, that it wasn't kind of like a moment like when Jibby Savile died or something, you know what I mean, that there wasn't some sort of kind of, oh my God, and now let's go a different direction and a better direction. It hasn't happened. It feels like it could still happen, but there's an extraordinary smear campaign going on around the cast review, and I think this is why we all need to speak up. Anybody who is salaried or on any level of position of responsibility, you can stand up, you can speak, you can refer to the cast review, and now is the time to do it. I think it's very important.
Okay, I have huge compassion for you, but I don't have any great answers. I'm sorry, but I hear you. In terms of why small groups manage to have disproportionately large influence, read my PhD on conflicts of interest in medicine, freely available at the University of St Andrews Library. We need systems to protect health systems from undue influence, no matter where it's coming from. When we try and do things according to evidence, there are massive systems to do that. Like, for example, if you look at the way that NICE generate evidence, there's a huge process that goes through. And yet it seems that you can be one of 3 people, I don't know how many, in the BMA that says we want a review, and then that all kind of happens. So we need organisational protections. And again, I think this is a patient safety issue. And I think we have to see it within that framework of how to make institutions that rely on evidence as opposed to lobby groups, wherever they're coming from, single issue groups, pharmaceutical societies, whatever. We have to create a way to deal with the evidence fairly. I mean, it's a difficult, complicated area, but one thing I would like to say is that I have spent maybe the last sort of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years writing letters of complaint, asking organisations to look at things, and almost all of the time I'm told that you're the only one to complain.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think for those that can't speak up, the gentleman who's worried about, he wants to get a paper published that will be very helpful. We all have a moral obligation to be a part of this in any way that we can, and it looks different for everybody else. I am my brother's keeper. I am my sister's keeper. I have a moral duty to my fellow humans. So we all have to figure out what we can do to be part of the solution. I mean, if you can't speak out and be public, well, you can financially support organizations that are being very vocal on these issues, that are putting their neck on the line all the time. But this will be a point in history where 50, 100 years from now, people will look back and go, what the hell were they doing? But no puberty is blocked without a doctor. No cross-sex hormones are prescribed without a doctor. No sexual reassignment surgeries are being done without a physician. And so, my passion, what I'm doing is I'm trying to call medicine to task. And there will be a reckoning. Whether it's in my lifetime or not, I don't know. But I'm going to work on this until I don't have any more breath.
Again, I've got so many things. So one is the lawsuits. I started that first judicial review. I've started another one. I'm taking on the CQC, who've awarded a certificate to a private clinic to do gender care for under 18. So I'm currently doing that. see me on Twitter, support the cause. I haven't heard back from them. We've submitted the papers, but we haven't heard back. But I also am aware that there are some detransitioners who are currently in process of taking. So my answer is that is somewhere where it hurts them. I don't love it, but it is a way of tackling that. To the multicoloured gentleman, you're right. The charities got in and they're powerful. And what I've worked out with this is there are a lot of people who devote a lot of time to this. The activists, they have a massive amount of technical knowledge. They're very good at networking their message, and they've sort of got in. And it is exhausting. I sometimes think I could do 10 different things tomorrow because I can see where things need tackling. But we need more helpers. Like, there's a lot of people who've been in this now for several years. It's pretty tiring. I think if everyone went away from here today with an idea that they're going to link up with one of the many sort of groups that are doing work, whether it's in education, whether it's in gay rights, whether it's in children's support networks, whatever. There's so many, but medical and clinical is mine. But, to sort of look at offering something. If you can't speak out, then offer them time, offer them admin help, offer them anything you can. Okay, I've got the yellow card again. And the other thing is just to say that I don't think there's any single answer. And certainly when people say, oh, well, psychotherapy isn't evidence-based, I'm not saying, any one of us has got the single answer, but I think if we as groups keep trying to resist, join with other people, because it's so helpful when you've got a team of people. And the other thing that's worked really well is when one person does a really good letter, and then 100 people sign it. So once you identify who your good letter writers are, you don't try and do it by committee because that's exhausting. Someone writes a letter unless there's something glaringly wrong with it. You all sign it and send it to the Education Authority, the NHS, your local MP, whatever. So those are my things about how to get on with this and sort of try and make some more progress. Sorry, I went over time.
I think what we've seen is corruption of the health service and corruption of the education service. And all of us who speak out in small or big ways are recognising that and helping to solve it. We should use CAS. What's happening now? What the trans activists did was produce study after study after study after study, all bad studies, but proving their case. And so what happens is you start thinking, well, there's so many studies, there must be something in this. And that's what they're doing now with CAS, if you notice. They're doing sort of study or, fake study after fake study to prove that CAS is... What's this? Danny just started. So actually what we need to do, all of us, is use CAS, because actually the grown-ups cannot ignore CAS. As soon as you criticise CAS, you're making a comment about yourself, and we know that. The politicians know that. The grown-ups know that. So use it. There's a MindEd hub with education, guidance for schools. Why aren't schools using that? CAS is our weapon's the wrong word. We need to arm up. We've got something that is really proper now. It's grown up research. It's respected, and we need to, all of us, use CAS and let that give us courage.
Sorry for the red card. So let's thank our panelists, especially Jennifer, who's come all the way from America and now has to rush off to catch a plane. And thank you all for coming and for your thoughtful comments and questions.